Hey Susie, I got a great idea for a book.
What?
Some dictionary nerds do some dictionary stuff to solve a dictionary mystery.
Who are you? How did you get this number?
All you gotta do is write it.
I'm sorry, I must decline.
Oh, come on, you're smart. It'll be great. A guaranteed success.
I'm afraid your velleity will fall on deaf ears.
Is that a yes?
It's an I wouldn't pin your hopes on an entelechy.
Huh?
I don't wish to take umbrage, but you are beginning to irk me.
Eh?
I'm growing quite ireful with you. I suggest a heathensith before you get broggled as a rack.
What?
How about you take a long operation of a short pier?
Come again?
Go grub a wasp's nest with your pillycock.
Is she in? I'm gonna say yes.
Hello and good afternoon. Apologies for not getting this out at the usual time. Probably. Turns out I'm a bit of a tids optimist. Today we look back at that oddly popular yet highly specific genre of mystery crime fiction written by a mild-mannered British TV personality with this, Guilty by Definition by Countdown's own Susie Dent. It follows Martha Thornhill, senior editor at the Clarendon English Dictionary. 10 years ago she fled Oxford, following the mysterious disappearance of her older sister Charlie. After hiding in Berlin for 10 years, she has returned home, but the past is not forgotten, and ghosts are waiting for her. Strange letters start arriving at the CED office, addressed to Martha and her team, merely signed Chorus. Spurred on by these letters, the editors begin digging up the truth about what really happened to Charlie all those years ago, but not everyone wants the truth exhumed, and would do anything to let sleeping ghosts lie. So yeah, it's of that mystery thriller vibe as opposed to a murder mystery, and instead of forensics and alibis, it focuses more on puzzles and cryptic clues. Whilst Martha is undeniably the main character, the book is a multi-perspective, also having chapters from Alex and Safi's point of views, with them being other editors at the CED. We can't really talk about this book without also talking about the author. Susie Dent is a lexicographer, best known for her work on Countdown and its comedy spin-off 8 out of 10 Cats Does Countdown. She resides in Dictionary Corner and does a segment called Origin of Words, where she answers etymology questions and does deep dives into the history of various phrases. She comes across as a very down-to-earth, very modest and very sensible lady. She tells us in her acknowledgements that she actually turned down the role a couple of times before finally accepting, and also that the publication of this book was a bit backwards. Instead of writing a book and then approaching publishers, it was actually the publisher, Zafra, I think I said that wrong. I don't care. Who approached her and asked if she would consider writing a book. There are two problems I have with celebrity authors. Firstly, and most obviously, the quality isn't always there. Now, that's not to say that all celebrity books are terrible, because they're not. And that's not to say that all non-celebrity books are great, because they're not. But talking in the broadest strokes, celebrity books generally aren't brilliant. And it's for understandable reasons. They aren't writers. Usually they haven't trained, they haven't gone on retreats or done courses or spent years honing their craft, going to workshop groups and all that. And often they're born either as a cash grab, which no one likes, or they're just fulfilling some strange ambition to be a serious author and are now famous enough to become one without that pesky work. Or they just write a book because a random publishing house asked them to. Why not? It's not like there are a glut of people who are serious and passionate about creative writing, struggling to get published. Why not put your money and effort into a random celebrity with no interest in writing a book and make them write a book? Not that I'm bitter at all. The second problem I have is that it can make it very difficult to separate art from artist. Generally, if the author isn't famous outside of authoring, it's very easy for them to fade into the background when you read the book. But when the author is better known as something else, they remain sharply in focus. I find if the book is different enough from what the author is known for, I can separate them quite well. When I think of Richard Osman, I don't think of old ladies. He, as the celebrity author, is not present in the book, so he doesn't get in the way. I never once pictured the main character as Richard Osman hunched over in a floral dress and a wig. When I think of Richard Coles, on the other hand, I do think of mild-mannered vicars. So when I read his Clement Cannon books, I can't help but see Richard Coles as the main character. Fortunately, Coles isn't that dissimilar to Daniel, so it isn't too distracting. Here, in a book all about the history of language and the dictionary, where so much of the narration and main character's thought processes focus on words and etymology, you can bet Susie Dent was at the forefront of my mind throughout. So whenever the main character did something distinctly un-Susie Dent-like, it took me right out of it. Which is perhaps a little unfair of me, because it's hardly Susie Dent's fault, that's how my brain works. But I can't absolve her of it fully for reasons I'll get into later. With all that out of the way, let's get into it. As one can probably imagine, Susie Dent obviously has great command of the English language and deploys a very sophisticated vocabulary. In a genre that has been so heavily infiltrated by very sparse, very style over substance books, it is refreshing to read something that actually weaves a rich tapestry of language instead of relying on short, sharp, empty sentences for lazy impact. There are some lovely passages in this, some nice thoughtful pieces in the early chapters about the importance of language and the history of Oxford pleased me, and later on there were some really nice turns of phrase and imagery. There was one line I really liked after Martha has a difficult conversation with her co-worker Simon. You know how in The Sims, when they have a bad interaction and little negative relationship symbol appears over people's heads? It was basically one of those conversations, and she sits back in her desk and there's a line about her hearing the snapping of threads around her. I really liked that. It was very visceral, loaded with sensation. You can see the strings around her and feel the tension and hear the tiny snapping, insignificant by themselves but deafening together. And the reader knows exactly what the image means, what the emotions are, and feel the scene. That is the power of similes and metaphors in writing. I think Charlie was represented well. Despite not being present, the effects of her presence are still so keenly felt by the characters that you do get a strong sense of her character. I liked Martha's memories of Charlie, sometimes glistening and idealised, sometimes darkened with projections of her own insecurities. It all felt real, which is good. In fact, a lot of Martha's memories in general were good. They're a bit filmy, sort of more collections of snatched images, but I think it worked. It was a good mystery, in my opinion. I suppose the culprit is a little obvious, but I didn't mind that too much. This book feels as much about the why and the what as the whom. I did enjoy the crossword-like clues and the cryptic letters, but I can also understand why other people may not have liked them. Alex, for instance, would hate them because he hates cryptic crosswords. I did raise an eyebrow at some of the solutions, especially the music one. I'm not totally convinced it worked or made sense, but I also raised my eyebrows at cryptic crosswords in the newspaper and will complain bitterly and at length about what I consider poor clues, so. There was some crumhorn representation, which I always appreciate. Not sure it's the best instrument in the world for playing Beyonce songs. Not that I know any Beyonce songs. I liked Alex and Safi as characters. Alex is this middle-aged lady with fancy taste in clothes and furniture. Very no-nonsense. Safi is the youngest member of the team, very enthusiastic and brings a sort of determined brightness to everything, from her colourful, betasseled bike to the pom-pom on the end of her pencil. And there are two cats in this, Raglan and Rochester. Both are excellent cat names. 10 out of 10. There are, I think, three main issues with this book. Number one, it has a real first book vibe to it, which is maybe a stupid thing to say considering this is her first fiction book. But what I mean is this. There are many authors who do not publish their first book. They will write, and write, and write, and if they are lucky, eventually stumble across something marketable. Not always, and you can usually tell the ones who get lucky on their first try, but the ones who don't have more of a chance of improving the overall writing before they reach publication. This has the ring of first book about it, but it's a very difficult thing to describe and explain. It's not a big thing, but lots of little things, and you just sort of feel it. There's something about the construction, about how it fits together, something more in the joints than anything else. It's just a bit clumsy, a little inelegant, but in places where it doesn't matter so much, or in such small ways that you don't notice why. For example, there are lots of wases. She was sitting, he was looking, where it is stronger to say she sat or he looked, unless it is specifically an interrupted action. There's a disconnect between action and the dialogue in places. Slightly odd wording, like her eyes scanned the room instead of she scanned the room. Strange focus, like when they're eating crisps and they randomly focus in on the tang of vinegar for no reason, adding nothing except an unnecessary sense of importance. Pacing issues within scenes, along with a tendency to miss crucial moments, not hit the emotional pinnacles. I'm not surprised, considering this is her first book, and it sounds like she wasn't doing very much creative writing before this, if at all. So there we go. The second issue I had, which is probably the one that will turn most people off this book, is the language thing. And obviously Susie Dent, very intelligent lady, loves her language. I think she relies too much on that love of language and her place in the British zeitgeist as the word person in this book. There are so many passages dedicated to explaining the history, the coinage, the usage of various obscure words. And on the one hand, it's very interesting, if you're into it. I love etymology and words. I find it fascinating. I was probably one of the few people on my university course who genuinely really enjoyed the modules on the history of English language. So interesting. So when I say it's too much in this book, I mean it. It's too much. It interrupts the flow and the pacing. It slows everything down and just gets in the way. It's all right in the early chapters before the plot really gets going, and it's all about the setup and characterisation, but it persists throughout. There are some chapters which, if you took out these superfluous English lessons, would only be a couple of paragraphs long and don't really say anything. And it's something that happens regardless of who the POV character is. If it just happened for Martha's chapters to show her constant musings on language as being a defence mechanism, her withdrawing in on herself to hide from the realities around her, it probably would have worked better, but all the characters do it, and it just felt a bit weird and forced. Especially when they aren't words that they read or hear at the moment. It's like they have a very eloquent inner monologue which they analyse in real time, and because of this, these long asides kind of come out of nowhere. It's like you're reading your mystery book and getting into an exciting scene, and suddenly Susie Dent pops up from behind a desk, explains where the word orientate comes from, and then buggers off again. And I'm not convinced it's Susie Dent's fault. I don't know, obviously, but part of me wonders if she was told to write it like that, to put in all these odd words and explanations, because that's what she's famous for. She's Susie Dent from Dictionary Corner. How else could she write a book? I can only speculate because I wasn't there for the editing process, obviously. But as she admits, she didn't set out to write this book until she was asked. I do wonder how much of a hand the editors had in putting it together and dictating the writing style. Although, I did genuinely quite enjoy the obscure words and definitions as chapter titles. I know some people didn't, but I like words. The third issue is Martha's character, more specifically her lack of character. I just couldn't pin her down. She didn't really seem to have much of a personality, which is a shame because she would be a very interesting character study. Someone very intelligent in their own right, who spent their entire childhood being overshadowed by a more brilliant sibling. Was there a golden child scapegoat situation going on? Don't know, as we only have her memories, which are not always perfect. She has conflicting emotions about Charlie, both looking up to her and loving her, and also feeling some resentment. Martha is always on the run from something and defends herself by either leaving physically or just mentally withdrawing. These are all very interesting facets, but they don't quite come together into one coherent character. She mostly just seems withdrawn and a little ethereal. A bit not there, and randomly she'd break out of that and react so sporadically that they didn't really inform us of anything. And this is why I have to give Susie Dent some of the blame for my constantly imagining her as the main character and then being pulled out when she suddenly does something a bit different. Martha is a word expert who is often mild-mannered, hovering just on the sidelines, very calm, very still, and a bit detached. A little like Susie Dent on Countdown, and you become complacent in that comparison. It is an anchor, something real to ground the character in the absence of anything else. And then every now and again she suddenly switches and starts swearing or something, which is very un-Susie Dent-like. And I have to remind myself, that's not Susie Dent. That's the character. Susie Dent's underneath the desk waiting to teach us all about the origin of parasocial. These aren't the only issues in the book, but I think they're the main ones. Everything else kind of falls under these umbrellas, but here are some of those other issues anyway. I felt like there were bits missing, mostly around Berlin. There are several mentions of Berlin, of Martha having run away from Berlin in the same way she ran away from Oxford a decade previously. She lost weight in Berlin. She doesn't like talking about Berlin. She can't even bring herself to talk to her friends from Berlin. And we don't get any sort of explanation or relief until the epilogue. And honestly, it's a bit of a letdown. And it didn't feel sufficient to explain her reaction and emotions around it. She mentions his friend Sabine quite often, to the point you'd think there'd be a nice reunion, but no, it's completely glossed over and once briefly mentioned retrospectively. It was trying a bit too hard to have commentary on things like feminism and beauty standards and the such. It's very much a background feature and not a focus, but it was a bit heavy-handed whenever it reared its head. There was this weird thing, for example, about the Pre-Raphaelites, where Martha is compared to one of the Pre-Raphaelite ladies, the models, you know, with the long red hair, and she tries to twist it into a negative thing, or that it's not the compliment you think it is, which No, I don't think it's fair to take the beauty away from them. It would make sense to say that they are not the only way to be beautiful, as they're trying to make them out to be not beautiful, which is just silly. They are beautiful and not sickly. I don't know anyone who's ever described the pre-Raphaelite models as sickly. They're just sort of fantastical. The dialogue was quite stilted and forced at times, like it didn't always sound real or very human. I feel that could have been worked on a bit more to inject a little more personality. Everyone pretty much had the same voice. Everyone also spoke in long, perfectly recalled quotes from all over the place, which I just found a bit odd. I know there are people who do, and I occasionally will drop in a line or two from literature, but generally it's like a phrase, "Once more into the breach, dear friends," or "curiouser and curiouser," not full Shakespearean speeches. Mostly because my memory is horrendous, and whilst I love literature, I will not remember long passages word for word. My brain just does not work that way. I know there are some people whose brains do, but I think it's an amalgamation of every character in the book doing this, the density of it and the length of the quotes, and the diversity of them too. It was just a bit much. It was like a book full of Fraser Cranes with no Martins or Rosas to give them grounding. I don't know, maybe if there was more indication of the individual characters' interests through the quotes. In the TV show Shakespeare and Hathaway, the character Sebastian is always quoting Shakespeare, but he's an actor who's super into Shakespeare, so it makes sense. I think Dent could have done something like this here. They're already supposed to have different interests when it comes to words. One is into dialects, another into phobias, etc. But this individuality doesn't expand into their dialogue. You could have one character be super into poetry and therefore quote reams of Tennyson, one into theology who knows the Bible and the Talmud inside out, one into Victorian fiction who likes dropping Dickensianisms every other hour. Just a bit more rhyme and reason to it. Most of these literary references aren't explained too much, which is fine, we don't need it. But of all the references in this book, 42 being the answer to life, the universe and everything is not one that needs explaining. "You got that reference?" asked Safi to someone who seems able to reference and perfect quote everything. Of course she got it. Everyone got it. There are bacteria living beneath rocks on the moon that got it. Ironically, the bit I would have liked explaining is the phrase peppercorn rent, because of how its meaning has literally changed from something very expensive to something very cheap. I'm sure these characters would all know that, thus making the intended meaning a tad unclear. I mean, I'm sure they meant the modern meaning, but everything else got an explanation. Why not this? There are some slight spoilers, but I did want to talk about a couple of things from later on. Firstly is my boy Simon. Simon is the 4th editor in the office and the only man. Not the only male character by any means. We also have the head editor guy, Jonathan, who's also an author and TV personality. I'm imagining him as a bit of a Lucy Worsley if she only talked about Shakespeare. There's also Oliver Caldwell, a detective, but he doesn't really do anything. And Gabriel, Martha's father, but he just sits around moping the entire book whilst being a butthead, so... So Simon is the only real main male character, and honestly, I got the feeling that Susie Dent didn't really care for him. He feels a bit left in the background, used only for throwaway jokes and sort of to make the others look better. He's a jokester, typical bad one-liners, wears bright Hawaiian shirts and all that. He manages to solve one of the clues, which is glossed over, and doesn't really do anything else of note until this dramatic reveal, maybe halfway through or just over. Martha, when she was 18 or so, had a relationship with Jonathan, who would have been about 30, which is quick, but anyway. She tells Simon this because he deserves to be kept in the loop, even though she suspects he will react badly because he had also applied for Martha's role as senior editor and was passed over in favour of her, despite having more experience and having worked at the CED for several years. Firstly, this scene should have been very dramatic and impactful, but it wasn't. It's like we had the beginning of the conversation, then the book decided to skip over the actual conversation because it would have been just repeating the same information, and jumped straight to Simon being very surly and angry and upset about it. Which just didn't work. You don't get the full understanding of his emotions, and we don't know exactly what Martha says. Simon has teenage daughters whom he loves. I just don't believe that upon hearing how Martha was essentially groomed by an older man when she was a teen, he would react like that. Did she omit that part or downplay it? Dunno. But it feels like we should know, right? After this, Simon becomes very withdrawn and bitter. He does a complete 180, and he's given some space. But there's this underlying feeling of the others looking down on him for not immediately accepting what has happened and getting over it. When we know that Simon is struggling already with having an unsuccessful book, being divorced and likely single, and I think money troubles are hinted at too. And then the characters discover the true depth of his life. The description of his house alone gives us such a strong image of someone deeply depressed, deeply frustrated, and someone lonely with very little to hold on to. It's so tragic. And then he turns up dead, and he made mistakes. He did things he shouldn't have. He dabbled in blackmail and theft, and I'm not excusing those actions, but it felt like the book really wanted to condemn him for these things. Like all the other characters seem to remember was this bad stuff he'd done, and it coloured everything. But I just thought it was so tragic, so sad, such a dismal picture of desperation, and I felt so sorry for him. I felt this book should have shown him more compassion, more sympathy, more understanding. I think of all the characters, I actually felt the biggest kinship, the most connection with Simon. Obviously, I'm not a middle-aged divorced man and father of teenage daughters. And yet something about his trying and failing, his passion for his work, his constantly being looked over and ignored for something else, someone else less qualified or less talented, just because they got lucky where he didn't. I think that's something that a lot of artists feel in this day and age. It doesn't matter how good you are, you need a stroke of luck, and if you never get it, you never get it. In a world of Cinderella stories and motivational speakers pumping out this nonsense about hard work and perseverance always pays off, there's something powerful about showing characters experiencing the reality of it, the 99%. Again, I'm not excusing the things he said or did, but I do think he deserved more than this book gave him. The other spoilery thing I wanted to talk about is the police interview at the end. Actually, the police investigation in general seemed a bit off. Martha meets with this hunky detective who basically makes her investigate everything for him. Like, these letters keep arriving, stirring up all this stuff about Charlie, who went missing, and who he suspects is probably dead. And you want the civilian to dig into it? When, if Charlie is dead, there's a possibility she was murdered, and you want a civilian to look into it? How about, I don't know, you do your job? Anyway, the finale of this book is this police interview. Martha is allowed in the interview room for reasons, and Alex and Safi are allowed to watch from the other room, the little, like, two-way mirror thing you get. Which, I'm no expert, but I don't think that's how it works. I mean, can you imagine, like, Line of Duty just letting random civilians in? And not only that, letting them basically lead the interview. Oliver Caldwell just sits there like a lemon and lets Martha do all the questioning. And the suspect's lawyer doesn't really mention it, which, like, yeah, right, lawyers are sticklers for things like this. But no, all he says is that he's advised his client against the interview and then quits halfway through. Yeah, he sees it's going badly and is just, I've resigned from so-and-so's lawyer, effective now. No, that's not how lawyers work. It's not a normal thing. What? You're paid to represent someone, regardless of guilt. What the heck is actually going on here? I don't know, maybe it's how it works. It didn't seem right to me, though. Also, side note, a police interview is a rubbish way to end a book. It's so anticlimactic. I know there's an epilogue afterwards, but it's just not a strong ending to the drama. This one wasn't anyway. One final thing, we had a hunky detective clearly implied to be a love interest, and no romance. Rude. I do think it's a good book. At the end of the day, if someone said Susie Dent wrote a mystery, I suppose this is the sort of thing I would expect, and more importantly, it's what the readers would expect. It's not bad by any means. Dent obviously has a great passion for words and language, and you can't fault her for writing about what she knows best. Do I think there's room for improvement? Yeah. And I think if Susie chooses to write a second book, it will be even better. But I'm not totally convinced she's going to. I don't know, I got the impression that while she enjoyed doing this, it's not her true passion. But who knows, maybe she's caught the bug. Would I recommend this? I think so. It has a sort of Morse or Lewis vibe to it, and not just because this is set in Oxford. It's the puzzle setup, the sense of the dark academia, like an episode of Midsummer, but far less crazy and far more highbrow. With a bit of tweaking, this could be a conspiracy thriller akin to the Da Vinci Code, but better written. So if it sounds like it's up your street, then check it out. But if you're the sort of person who fast forwards the origin of words segment on Countdown, this one maybe isn't for you. Next time, I return to my usual state of self-loathing for one last dive into Alex Astor's fantasy fever dream. Yay! Until then, goodbye.